us to get started here with our second panel, which is very fun. It's very thematically all about wrestling. Um, so it's aptly titled Wrestling with the Popular Form and Performance, which is very fun. So we're going to get started with Jules. So get your screen up or whatever you need to do. We will get started whenever you're ready.
I think Jules just got
I think we need to start with Adam, though. Yes, Adam? Do we need to start with
We're
you?
starting with Adam?
No, my wife was going to work early and leaving me with the kids, but now she's off today. So Jules is more than welcome to start.
Okay, sorry.
Thanks for thinking of me, though.
Well, if it's my turn to start, I guess it's my turn to start. 1 second. Sorry, everyone. I just had I had to restart my laptop a second ago. Here we go. Ha. There we go. Thank you so much, everyone, for giving me the chance to speak at the Ray Browne again. Out of all the conferences I've spoken at, this is always my favorite, for sure. Everyone's so friendly. It's such a nice, relaxed atmosphere. I get to wear my fun Hawaiian banana shirts, which is always the most fun. And today we're going to do something fun. We're going to start out a little airy, a little fun. I'm going to be talking about wrestling with the pandemic, the performance of professional wrestling during COVID-19. Now, professional wrestling. Hang on a second. That's not how I want that. Sorry, everyone. 1 second. There we are. Professional wrestling is actually one of the earliest sites in popular culture studies. A little bit redneck soap opera, a little bit Power Rangers. Pro wrestling is the improvised art of making a staged fake fight look as authentic and as entertaining and as real as possible, which is a pretty tough line to walk, hence why it is a performance, why it is an art. And while it may have peaked early back in the 90s, it is still a thriving business to this day. WWE, which is definitely the biggest and the most famous of all of the pro wrestling companies, just had its best financial year ever. Even though we are in the middle of a global pandemic, just in the last quarter of 2020 alone, the WWE made $238.2 million just in the last quarter of the year. Again, this was their biggest year ever in terms of financial gains. So clearly COVID has nothing on bringing us down in professional wrestling business-wise. But how is the entertainment affected? How is the performance of the wrestling itself? How has that changed? That's what I'm much more interested in. And the answer is, well, it's very obvious. And it's the same thing that has affected sports as heavily as it has. It's the audience. It is the audience. It is the live crowd that is not there. More so than most sports, more so than anything aside from perhaps live theater. Audiences are the lifeblood of pro wrestling. Any big moment that you could have, whether it is Hulk Hogan slamming Andre the Giant down in the main event of WrestleMania, whether it is any hero rising to the top, whether it is a villain that comes in and cheats their way to a title and everyone is booing and jeering them. All of the greatest moments of pro wrestling they come less from the writing itself and less from the performance itself, and it is more from the crowd and the energy and the reactions that they have. The reactions, as we can see, being some of the most entertaining and some of the most colorful of all of the entertainment forms that we have out there. And it is this connection with the live crowd that defines pro wrestling. Almost every superstar that has gone on record in 2020 or at the beginning of 2021 have all complained that COVID-19 taking away the crowd has made their job more difficult in terms of creating a narrative and a story, and it has made it less satisfying as entertainers. It's not as good of a job to have when you don't have a crowd to play with. Anyone that's ever been in a play or a musical before knows exactly what I'm talking about. But the connection with your audience is so important. And as we can see here, just look at these crowds, look at the energy that is there, especially that image on the right. It is so important having this crowd there and having this connection between the two, which poses the question for all of these performers and these companies, how do you perform without your live crowd? Because without this crowd, it's almost like you're performing within a vacuum. Look at all of these empty seats. There's no energy, there's no love, there's no buzz, there's no cheering and booing. So where does all of this emotional energy come from? How do pro wrestlers connect? How do they create a story? How do they create moments? But not only how have the wrestlers changed, but how have the companies been able to adapt? Well, in two major ways, one for each one of the people we're talking about. In terms of the companies, they have been forced to find new ways of filming and focusing their cinematography, focusing less on the crowd reactions themselves and more on the people within the ring. And the performers themselves have begun to play less to the live crowd and the connection there to the front row and all of the stands around them, and more having to connect through the camera with the people at home. So first, looking at these changes to this camera angle, we can see in this image here, and going back to a couple of these other ones, look at how central the audience is in every one of these pictures. Even looking at this image here, it is clear that the camera is focusing on the superstar in the ring, but the crowd is as much a part of this shot as anything else is. The crowd, the audience, is just as important in this moment as this man celebrating is. It's vital. And most of these shots produced make sure to show the audience and the crowd as much as possible. It has always been in the DNA of the shot selection, of the cinematography of wrestling, which I think we're going to hear about a little later from another one of our speakers, so I won't talk about that too much. But this clearly had to change going into the pandemic era. So one of the newer companies, All Elite Wrestling, or AEW, was one of the first companies to really begin adapting to the pandemic. And within a couple weeks of losing their live crowds, they made two major but groundbreaking changes to the way that they film professional wrestling. The first is that they've changed the way that they shoot and the actual camera angles themselves to focus less on the big crowd shots that we're used to and more smaller, more tightly focused shots on the ring themselves. Not looking at the crowd in the sea of faces, but looking instead at the two performers in the ring and really focusing on the two of them go at it. The other one, which I think is much more genius, is that they began filling their front rows with other professional wrestlers. You can invite in live crowds, but you still have all of the other wrestlers in the back, people that might be on injury, people that might just not have had a match that night. They put them and they have now a front row, so they have an audience to speak of. And of course, the greatest and the biggest pro wrestling fans are pro wrestlers themselves. So you have a red hot crowd there that can cheer, that can boo, that can give you all of the energy that you need. So now we are focusing the camera, not focusing on the crowd, which we're missing, but focusing on the ring and seeing things that we might have missed before. Well, also now we have a small enough crowd and an intimate enough crowd in this front row to create the energy, to create the noise that we need to really make the moment pop for the audiences at home. Now, the WWE, the huge titan that it is, took a little while longer to adapt to the pandemic. So big and so used in their ways that they found themselves not wanting to change course. However, when they did, they started following the AEW lead and changing their presentation as well, with one major difference. Instead of doing the big crowd of wrestlers around the ring, a couple months ago, they introduced the Thunderdome, as you can see in this image, a large wall of LED screens that surround and fill where the crowd would be. And each one of those screens is the face of an audience member, a fan at home, live streaming themselves into the surroundings so that you get the facial expressions, you get the excitement, you get the joy, you get the face of kids and adults alike bouncing up and down, so excited to see their performers, which is great. The problem is that we can't hear them. And as I said before, the sound itself is so much more important than the faces and the reactions themselves. It's the cheers, it's the boos, it's the yelling, it's the energy itself, it's the audio that we care about. The problem with the Thunderdome is that it gives the WWE control over the audio itself, and it gives them control over how they think their audiences should react. Historically, wrestling fans don't always do what they're supposed to do. A hero might be a hero, but Hulk Hogan was not always cheered. Sometimes he got booed even though he was supposed to be the good guy. sometimes a bad guy might be a bad guy, but he does something cool. She does a really good one-liner that really gets the audience laughing, and they're going to get applauded for it. And the WWE doesn't like this. And the problem is that they've always had a history of going back and rewriting history a little bit, muting microphones in the crowd to cut down on boos, or going back post-production to change audio levels. And this problem has only increased in the times of the pandemic. And this is definitely one of the major negatives that has come across in terms of the company's presentation during this time, is the fact that now they are in control over how audiences are allowed to react. But this is only one half of the story. The other question is how the wrestlers themselves have changed their performance. Again, wrestling is a cooperative event. The two wrestlers are constantly talking and whispering to one another, making sure that both of them are on the same page, planning moves out ahead of time, warning the other person before they do a move to make sure that no one gets hurt. With COVID, though, and the action being more focused in the ring than ever, they've had to change the style a little bit. Instead of connecting to the audiences in the crowd, they've begun connecting more to the audiences through the camera, connecting to the audiences at home. One thing that was never really a part of pro wrestling was dialogue. After all, you're talking about a stadium meant to play football in. You're talking thousands of people. There's no way that dialogue can get through farther than the front row. So normally dialogue isn't a thing in pro wrestling. It's all about the physicality. However, in times of COVID, when all of the microphones and all of the cameras are focused in the ring instead of in the crowd, dialogue has begun to appear more and more often in pro wrestling. We have superstars talking back and forth to one another. Villains especially have used this opportunity to begin saying dastardly little one-liners, insulting the hero, saying things either for or directly to the camera. And this dialogue has come across. And personally, I think that this is one of my favorite things that has come across in the new era, is this playing to the camera, because I'm always watching it at home on my couch, but now I feel as though I am the focus rather than the focus being the live crowds that paid tickets. So wrapping up and to conclude, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected every aspect of our lives. And we really thought that this was going to be the thing that was going to kill pro wrestling, given how important audience reaction has always been to the art form. But the companies and the performers themselves have been able to change and adapt over time. AEW may have been the first one, but all major pro wrestling companies have changed the way they shoot their broadcasts, not to focus on the crowd, but to focus on the action in the ring itself. The wrestlers themselves have begun to play more for the camera, not focusing on the thousands of people around them, but focusing on the 4 people sitting on the couch at home through the camera. Of course, there have been some big changes to everything in our lives, and especially big changes into the industry of pro wrestling today. But it has survived, it has thrived, and it has continued growing through 2020 into 2021. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jules. That was really great. Like, up next on our schedule, we have Nick. So whenever you're ready to start, you can get to it.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Thank you, Jules. Pleasure to make your acquaintance, sir. All right, folks. So this is actually part of, I hope everybody can see that. This is entitled Wrestling Through the Aperture, Editing, Cinematography, Narrative, and Ideology in the Golden Age of Professional Wrestling. And it's actually my favorite standout chapter. It's the 4th chapter of my up-and-coming dissertation, which focuses on the in-ring WWF career of Hulk Hogan. Now, I grew up a Hulk Hogan fan, but the older I get, the more I realize that that was probably not a coincidence. And the purpose of this dissertation is actually more or less a response to J.J. Mondak, who wrote a very popular article on the politics of professional wrestling in the 80s, and how characters such as Hulk Hogan are symbolic creations of neoliberalism. I acknowledge that there is truthfulness to that, but I disagree. I actually argue he's fundamentally wrong in that Hulk Hogan or characters in popular culture are actually literal creations of neoliberalism. Hulk Hogan specifically is a good example of that, because we see that there are certain industrial and political and cultural forces that come together, not necessarily just to create the character, but allow that character to succeed. and that only during this time in the neoliberal 80s and 90s could a character such as Hulk Hogan been created and thrived and launch himself into the mainstream popular culture the way he did. So as we kind of just sat through, we realized that it's kind of an interesting time to maybe watch wrestling or to study wrestling, because we understand that there's this cinematization, quote unquote, of wrestling going on. Companies like WWE, Impact, AEW are doing what's called these cinematic style matches that seem to resemble more or less a film. But actually, if we look at the history of WWE, we understand that WWE's goal, ever since Vince McMahon purchased the company from his father in the early 1980s, has always been production. It's always been a mimicry of Hollywood, of a Hollywood-like product. So John Fisk, in his book from 1987, Television Culture, he was kind of one of the first people to notice that in televised wrestling in the 1980s, there is a focus on reaction shots. And he argues that these reaction shots are part of the spectacle itself, and how this is different from not watching wrestling on television. And in more recent years, we've seen people talk about the use of camera angles, camera movement, how that itself plays a role in, say, wrestling's mode of storytelling. That's why it's different from actually watching wrestling live in a hall or in an arena. And of course, we understand this is, again, somewhat like a mimicry of Hollywood. But I'm actually arguing that some of these assertions miss the greater point, especially historically. When we look at the 1980s, we understand that there are ideological implications to these matches, to these camera angles, to these editing patterns, to these narrative structures. And this is especially true in the career of Hulk Hogan in the neoliberal 80s. So I'm asking, why do the matches of Hulk Hogan in the WWF from this specific time period look the way that they do? And what, if any, ideological implications are actually present in these patterns of editing, in this camera work, and in the way these narrative structures are portrayed on television? So I think you'll find that this is a heavily Marxist presentation. I'm kind of a proponent of apparatus theory, so perhaps this presentation to you, or this chapter, will look rather maybe Althuserian, a little more Althuserian than it is Gramscian, right? And I actually argue there's a good way to use Marx, Gramsci, and Althusser and apparatus theory to explain why Hulk Hogan's matches during this time looked the way that they did. So some of the texts that I'm going to be analyzing for you today, these are all some of those most popular matches discussed not only with Hulk Hogan, but in the career, or rather the history, the annals of the WWE. These are matches that are often cited on DVD box sets, on the WWE Network. Anytime WWE talks about their history of WrestleMania or something, maybe matches like these are often referenced. So the first match is Hulk Hogan versus the Iron Sheik from 1984. Hulk Hogan's most notable match probably ever, against Andre the Giant, WrestleMania 3. And there's not a match for the third one, but there is slightly we kind of mention a rematch, but it's more so about Hulk Hogan's feud with the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, and I'll get into that here in a second. So there's three filmic elements I'm going to be looking at: editing, cinematography, and narrative structure. Now, the first one, editing and the rhythm of television wrestling, is very unique. Editing, more or less, this is what I tell my undergraduates, it's the rhythm of filmmaking. It's the rhythm of a television show. Maybe it seems invisible or seamless, but actually editing itself has ideological and psychological transmissions. This is obviously usually influenced by the dominant culture, maybe the dominant ideology. So hopefully you can see these GIFs here I provided for you. Now notice there's Hulk Hogan lifting up the Iron Sheik to choke him, right? There's the shot of Hulk Hogan choking him, and then they cut to a close-up, well, a medium close-up of the Sheik. This was unlike wrestling in the previous decade. Wrestling was actually kind of boring to watch in the 70s and very, very early 80s. There was very limited camera movement. The camera was often static. Cutting was few and far in between. Wrestling holds would maybe last anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes long. But when Hulk Hogan comes to the WWE, the production style entirely changes. So the rhythm of a match will seem more like clothesline, cuts, a body slam, cuts, a kick to someone's stomach cut. So this kind of seems to mimic that of the action film rather than an actual legitimate wrestling sport. But what I think is one of the most interesting moments in Hulk Hogan's match with the Sheik is the image on your top right when Hulk Hogan lifts up his newly won belt and we see a slow lap dissolve into the audience. And uh, it actually does not transfer completely over to the audience. They actually hold this image of Hulk Hogan with the audience. So this seems to symbolize some sort of unity, oneness, a unification between this person and this American New York white working class. Now, theorists such as Shion have discussed that the Iron Sheik is a response to the Iranian Revolution. So Hulk Hogan's victory over this Iranian nationalist, this loyalist, while he's holding up his belt and a slow lap dissolve into the crowd, is not just about Hulk Hogan. Rather, it's an American victory over Iran and the Iranian Revolution. It's a response. And the same is true for cinematography. There are hegemonic notions and connotations in the cinematography of Hulk Hogan's matches. So, for example, when we look at his match with Andre the Giant, there's a lot of low angles that are used for Andre. Now, this is to emphasize or maybe even over exaggerate his size, right? There are two shots to show, which is a shot of Hulk Hogan and a shot of Andre the Giant to show the size disparity. Most of the time we get shots of Hulk Hogan crossing himself before the match, or maybe he's wearing his cross. There are full shots of him after he wins against Andre the Giant, thanking God, right? We have complete shots of his body to show off his pectorals, his biceps, his quadriceps, right? So there's some notions of hegemonic masculinity in this, what a man should look like, what the American male should look like or should desire to look like. So this is all, once again, I guess, not really residual, but connotations of the dominant ideology, right? We are made to sympathize with this Hulk Hogan character. Anytime Hulk Hogan's in a headlock, there's a zoom in on his face to show that he's suffering. We should feel sorry for him. But when that happens to, say, the Iron Sheik in the previous image, he very much deserves that. So actually, what I think is also one of the most unique feuds here in Hulk Hogan's career is his feud with the $1 Million Man, who's always wearing these kind of fake tuxedo jumpsuits, and he's always carrying around his money. He's asking people to do berating tasks so he can pay them. He's obviously like a hyper-capitalist, a predatory capitalist. Hulk Hogan, even though visually and aesthetically doesn't seem to represent the American white working class, through his rhetoric, we can kind of tell that Hulk Hogan is kind of a pseudo representation of the common American, which we translate to the working class white American. And this feud with Ted DiBiase is kind of similar to the popular films of the 80s, which brought attention to criticism of capitalism. So films like RoboCop, Trading Places, films like Wall Street, these are all films about how capitalism corrupts, but they're products of capitalist system that made a lot of money. And this feud between Hulk Hogan and Ted DiBiase, even though it does kind of address the issues of capitalism, good versus evil, the American working class versus the upper class, this is still augmenting the narrative pushed by capitalism, pushed by hypercapitalism and neoliberalism and even Reaganism. So to kind of conclude here today, I just want to kind of recapitulate that we see a focus on production in the 80s moving onward. We don't see this because of Hulk Hogan. We see this through his matches. And these are often, I suppose, once again, connotations of the dominant ideology. And these elements are all used strategically to kind of augment how Hulk Hogan was a literal creation of neoliberalism through industry and production practices and not symbolic. In the future, perhaps we could talk about, similar to what we just heard from Jules, who did that very well, about the current production practices of wrestling, WWE, AEW, what have you, and maybe the ideological connotations that accompany that. Here's a copy of my works cited. I encourage you to reach out to me if you have any further questions after today, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Nick. That was a great job there. Now I guess to round out our wrestling hour here. We have Adam. And then after Adam goes, we'll have some time for everyone to ask questions that they may have. So whenever you're ready, Adam, you can start.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Great. All right. So the title of my presentation is WWE and Saudi Vision 2030, which is about professional wrestling as cultural diplomacy. So in 2018, Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Entertainment, known as WWE, produced and aired 2 live pay-per-view wrestling events in Saudi Arabia. The events, called Greatest Royal Rumble and Crown Jewel, were the subject of media controversy in the US due to WWE's agreement to abide by Saudi law, which prohibited women wrestlers from participating in the event, and due to the fact that 1 month prior to Crown Jewel, the CIA concluded that the journalist and Washington Post columnist Jamal Ahmed Khashoggi, who was critical of the Saudi royal family, had been assassinated by the Saudi government. At this time, WWE has produced 3 additional pay-per-view shows in Saudi Arabia. But what is not widely known is that these 5 pay-per-views were not simply led by the invisible hand of the free market, but are part of a state-sponsored 10-year agreement between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and WWE under the umbrella of a large economic development plan known as Saudi Vision 2030. This was launched in April of 2016 with the aims of reducing the country's reliance on oil and promoting economic diversification and the development of sectors such as health, education, infrastructure, construction, recreation, and tourism. All of these events are significant in relation to WWE's involvement in Saudi Arabia's nation branding campaign. However, this article will focus on the first year, 2018, of the Saudi WWE partnership. While the shows in 2019 and 2020 had their own media coverage, the controversy surrounding the first year was framed by the murder of Khashoggi. I'll look at the political economy behind the production of these 2 2018 wrestling events. By focusing on the role of sport mega events in the context of generating what's called a nation branding legacy, I'm investigating the limitations of WWE's presence in Saudi Arabia as an effort to promote economic growth and social change. One question I had was, has this partnership between WWE and Saudi Arabia influenced how the 2 pay-per-views showcase themes of nationalism, patriotism, or Islamophobia? Professional wrestling in the US has a recognized history of relying on these themes, using exaggerated characters and real-life socio-political conflicts to construct what Roland Barthes has referred to as the spectacle of excess. However, Saudi Arabia's plan to use WWE to promote its Vision 2030 plan seems limited by the company's desire to stay fiscally viable. Though WWE is more than happy to promote Vision 2030 under the right conditions of international politics, the company is ultimately concerned with protecting itself and its own image in the face of political controversy made public by international media discourse. So the Saudi Vision 2030 plan is an 84-page document that describes Saudi Arabia's mission to liberalize their economy by 2030. The document can be accessed via their government website. And one particular section of importance is titled Promoting Culture and Entertainment. It states, quote, "We consider culture and entertainment indispensable to our quality of life. We are well aware that the cultural entertainment opportunities currently available do not reflect the rising aspirations of our citizens and residents, nor are they in harmony with our prosperous economy. It is why we will support the efforts of regions, governance, nonprofit, and private sectors to organize cultural events. We intend to enhance the role of government funds while also attracting local and international investors, creating partnerships with international entertainment corporations." And it states their goals by 2030, which is to increase household spending on cultural and entertainment activities inside the kingdom from the current level of 2.9% to 6%. The Independent newspaper published a 3-part piece in February 2018 about how this economic plan is bringing long overdue social reforms to Saudi Arabia, stating that, quote, people in Riyadh seem bolder. Teenagers roam around a new park on rollerblades while Justin Bieber blasts from cars stuck in traffic. Not surprisingly, these images are quite similar to those shown in a promotional video that aired during Greatest Royal Rumble, which I will later discuss. So a bit about my methodology. I will situate the partnership between Saudi Arabia and WWE in the context of nation branding. Nation branding is defined as a process by which a nation's images can be created, monitored, evaluated, and proactively managed in order to improve or enhance the country's reputation among a target of international audience. Nation branding opportunities through sport mega events is a topic of scholarly conversation in the fields of marketing, media, and communication. Not at all has stated that there has been a growing awareness of the potentially significant impact that hosting sport mega events such as the Olympic Games or FIFA World Cup can have on a country's brand image. With reliance to countries like Saudi Arabia, who are progressively trying to liberalize their society in order to compete in a global market, these authors state that sport mega events may provide an opportunity to create or promote an image and also rebrand a nation. Admission in the Saudi Vision 2030 document that the cultural and entertainment opportunities currently available do not reflect the rising aspirations of our citizens implies that the Saudis' importation of WWE sport mega events is an attempt to rebrand their nation. Examining transnational sports marketing, Michael Silk and David Andrews argue that sports can play a large role in reimagining national cultures. They state that although not wishing to deny the importance of the political and economic forces in shaping the modern nation, it is within the cultural realm that the nation has had its most enduring influence and effects. So I'll start by talking about the Greatest Royal Rumble, which was held in 2018 at the King Abdullah Sports City Stadium in Jihad. Unlike the following live WWE event to be held in Saudi Arabia 6 months later, Crown Jewel, which I'll later discuss, the Greatest Royal Rumble was overtly propagandist. The event's promotional video animation swirls the viewer around the sword of the Saudi Arabia flag, revealing the printed name of the event, while a male voiceover reads, live from Jeddah, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia proudly invites the world to witness history. The animation then cuts to shots of the interior or exterior of the sports stadium. And the animation occurs 3 times before the first match of the event. Often, WWE events begin with the national anthems or America the Beautiful. Greatest Royal Rumble begins with the national anthems of Saudi Arabia and the United States of America with flags and their respective colors on the Titantron. After that, another introductory video showing outside shots of the stadium and fireworks exclaims in both English and Arabic that this is the largest international televised event in WWE history. The camera then cuts to 2 ring announcers, Corey Graves and Michael Cole. Graves states, welcome as we celebrate Saudi Arabia's progression for cultural diversity in the Vision 2030 plan. And Cole replies, yeah, we'll be talking about that throughout the evening. It should be noted that these are literally the first words spoken by the American announcers, leaving no doubt as to the purpose of this event. After a match in which John Cena defeats a veteran known as Triple H, Cena is provided a mic in the center of the ring where he states, it has been an honor and a privilege to be allowed to be part of today. I want to send a genuine thank you to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for its unmatched hospitality that extends far beyond this evening. This sort of overt diplomacy displayed by Cena, Graves, and Cole, and the event in general, is fairly outside of character for WWE events abroad. I'll skip ahead a little bit to save time. We will, moving on to the Crown Jewel, which happened about 6 months later in November 2018. WWE produced and aired a second live pay-per-view at the Saud University Stadium in Riyadh, which is the capital of Saudi Arabia. The event, called Crown Jewel, was also highly controversial and received plenty of news media attention as a result. Unlike the Greatest Royal Rumble, Crown Jewel and WWE drew mainstream media criticism due to the fact that 1 month prior, the journalist Jamal Khashoggi was found dead with fingers pointing to the Saudi government as the responsible party. And there's been a lot in this week's news about that as well. Multiple national and international news organizations pressured WWE to cancel or move the event. The Baltimore Sun criticized WWE not only on the hypocritical exclusion of women wrestlers, but also brought up that 5 human rights activists are on trial or could face execution. Stanford Advocate connected the controversial wrestling event directly to the disappearance of Khashoggi, and also considered how this might hurt WWE's reputation, citing that since Khashoggi's disappearance, WWE stocks had dipped, and quoted Daniel Durden, director of the University of South California's Annenberg Institute of Sports Media and Society, saying, "This might pose a problem for scripted and entertainment purposes for the sport," while seeking legitimacy before the broader public. That attempt to engage a broader public cannot be helped by continuing to plan their showcase event in a country under scrutiny for, amongst other things, the possible murder of a journalist. Despite media pressure to cancel, move, or postpone the event, WWE decided to continue as planned. But Crown Jewel contained nothing that reeked of propaganda, neither in terms of US patriotism or Saudi patriotism. There's absolutely no mention of the Vision 2030 plan during Crown Jewel, nor does the event begin with the national anthems of either country. In fact, without actively looking, viewers at home might not even recognize that the event took place in Saudi Arabia. So I'll quickly just conclude. As communication and rhetoric scholar Greg Dickinson has argued, following the attacks of September 11th, corporate advertisers began rhetorically framing consumerism as a national civic duty that could heal a damaged nation. And it appears as though Saudi Arabia's partnership with WWE takes this framework and applies it to diplomatic US-Saudi relations. However, Saudi Arabia's plan to use WWE to promote Vision 2030 seems limited by the company's desire to stay fiscally viable. Professor of kinesiology Ted Burton states that the company is not above morphing its product into whatever it sees as the most viable profit-making entity domestically and internationally. In fact, it has a keen sense of when the larger political and cultural ties are shifting. While WWE is more than happy to promote Vision 2030 under the right conditions, the company is ultimately concerned with protecting itself and its own image. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. So now the floor is open. If anyone has any questions for any of our panelists, either feel free to unmute yourself or go in the chat.
Go ahead, Greg.
I've got a question for Adam because I honestly have not really been paying attention. I mean, I watched all of the Saudi pay-per-views when they were on because I have the network, but obviously since COVID, they haven't been able to travel overseas to do the Saudi shows, but they still have that big, long contract. Do you know what the plan is moving forward in a post-COVID world for continuing to do Saudi shows?
No, unfortunately, I don't. I actually haven't been following wrestling weekly. I've been watching some of the monthly pay-per-views, but as Jules mentioned in his presentation, the audience is really a key factor in the entertainment value of the product, really. So when COVID hit, I kind of stopped paying attention When I did the research for this article too, it had only been the first year, so only the first 2 pay-per-views that happened. I haven't even really paid attention to the next 3 that did already happen pre-COVID lockdown. So there's a lot of research past the first year that I haven't really gotten into. So sorry, I can't really answer your question.
No problem. The other 3 shows are really bad. You don't even need to bother to watch them unless for research purposes.
Yeah, I'll take your word for it. Thanks.
Yeah, they're not good.
Okay, looks like Jules, there is a question for you in the chat. Is the audience shift you're seeing the same in other genres of the past or today? And then what did it do to those genres as well?
Thank you, Lita. What do you mean by other genres? Like other genres of like live performance, like other genres of like pro wrestling?
So I'm not amazing at FISC and TV studies, but I think I remember that there are different conversations about the technology for live television with camera work, right? And that there is a particular way that like not recorded at all, kind of live like theater productions that are put on television in the 1950s, right? The way those are framed, or using kind of limited close-ups, right? So there's a style of acting that matches that kind of camera work. And then as cameras improve, acting for the camera changes. And I feel like there is scholarship about like playing to the camera as kind of your close-up, right? And I heard you saying that there are things we are seeing that we couldn't see before, and that we're losing sound, right? And I think that's kind of, though not exactly the same, might have a parallel if you looked at like early scholarship about like television and the things you could and could not use, right? And so kind of the limited language, right? Like it's almost like the actual like words aren't available, or like that way of speaking is not available. And so I'm curious, and maybe you don't know the answer, if there is a similar genre or moment where you move from not being able to see faces and really focusing on sound and like big open framing to much tighter framing, and the way that shaped people's perceptions of storyline or people's interaction with a particular story. I'm curious.
I see. Unfortunately, you're right. I don't have a direct answer to that, but I have like an anecdotal, like related comment. And it was, I remember you bringing that made me think of this. I remember I've taken a couple theater classes in my undergrad, and then I took one with the a performance studies class with the theater and performance people over in the Wolf Center. And I remember watching 2 musicals, and one was it was a Broadway recording of Into the Woods, and it was in a big traditional Broadway theater.
Recording.
Yeah, and it's a great recording and it's a great musical, but you can definitely tell that, like most theater, they're playing in it not quite for the front row, but for the front row all the way to the very back row. And it's very obvious while they are filming it with the camera all the way in the back that everything is very big and very extra, specifically to get the people in the very, very back of the row. On the other hand, in the performance class that I took, I think it was last summer, I think it was summer 2020, there was a recording of a British rendition of Dr. Faust. And that was done in a very, very small, very intimate theater. Now, that was a really, really good broadcasting. That was a wonderful recording of it, because the furthest row back was maybe 40 feet away from the stage. It was a very, very small venue. So because of that, and because of how small the audience was, the actors themselves were, instead of playing to people 150 feet away, were playing to people 30 feet away. So it was much smaller, much more nuanced, much more facial expressions. It wasn't as big and as bold. So just that change in the venue made it so that one recorded not poorly, but didn't record very well on film, whereas the other one corresponded very, very, very well when it was filmed. I know that doesn't perfectly answer your question, but that's the best anecdotal example I have. Sorry, Lita.
Hey, looks like there is one more question in the chat, as well as Nick, a request for your bibliography to put in the Padlet. And Judy, you asked Nick that you mentioned the editing change with Hulk Hogan. What was it about him that, you know, made them say this is the guy that we need to focus on?
Well, you know, some part of what this dissertation is kind of looking at is like it's not really Hulk Hogan. It's Frankfurt School 101, right? We don't see society because of Hulk Hogan. We see society. We see Hulk Hogan because of society. And with that being said, I mean, I think it's safe to say that throughout wrestling history, there were actually many Hulk Hogans or people who could have been in that spot. But I mean, he was doing very well in the Minneapolis area. He was one of the few Gaijin wrestlers in Japan to get corporate sponsorship. That's in a book called The Lion's Pride. So he had everything that they were looking for. And at the time when Vince McMahon was taking over his dad's company, we see this new division of labor. We see him destroying his competition. And one way he does that is he entices wrestling stars from other territories to come and join the WWE because he has all this money that he can pay them. And I mean, he did have charisma. He did have this kind of, I guess, cultural capital in several regions already, in Tampa and Japan and the Minneapolis area in the Midwest. And as someone just said, huge biceps. Yes. 24 inches to be exact. But he just happened. I part of it was he was the right place at the right time kind of guy, and he was everything Vince McMahon was looking for. He had an aesthetic, and his appearance in Rocky III went over very well with wrestling fans, and a lot of people really enjoyed his presentation in that film. And his role, as brief as it was more or less a glorified cameo. So I think part of it was, you know, the direction popular culture was heading. Part of it was his cultural capital he had in the wrestling world, both regionally and even internationally. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have. If anybody else wants to add to that.
Yeah, we do have time for one more question. So looks like Britt, you have one more for Nick as well.
So yeah, as Nick and I know, we've actually discussed his project on many occasions, and I've actually read this chapter of his dissertation to one degree or another, which is very good so far. My question is, and it just occurred to me, is you cover a lot of the in-ring cinematography, which you do a really good job of breaking down, you know, various cuts and edits and, you know, close-ups, you know, wide shots, et cetera, et cetera. Are you going to be talking about any of the backstage, either vignettes, interview segments, etc., that kind of portray? Well, the interview segments kind of portray it as, you know, like a sports interview, but some of the backstage vignettes, like say a backstage Piper's Pit, for instance, the one that led into WrestleMania 3, where Hulk Hogan joined with Bobby the Brain Heenan to turn on to turn on Hulk Hogan, is filmed kind of more like a 3-camera setup for a sitcom.
Yeah.
Are you going to be talking any about that at all in your dissertation? Just because that's one thing we haven't
probably expand that more in the narrative chapter, because some of these backstage segments, I mean, you know, they really not only mimic that of a sitcom, but somewhat of a soap opera, especially, you know, of the 1980s. So I mean, that stuff's too good to ignore. And I mean, soap operas are really taking off in the 80s. I mean, they were always popular, but you know, in the 80s and the 90s, Days of Our Lives and all that, it's really starting to take off. And you know, this is, again, it's a mimicry of the current televised product and everything. So yes, I mean, there's no way you can have this dissertation without acknowledging stuff like that. Yes.
If I could add something.
Yeah.
First of all, someone pointed out that Hulk Hogan was from their hometown. No, actually wasn't me.
Yeah.
Was that you, dear?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There are a bunch of people with my name. Some of them are my students because I gave them my Zoom link. I was told I could give that out for students who wanted extra credit. And one of them is actually my wife, Dr. Clinton. And oh, so he was from Brewster.
Yes, he was.
Ah. Also, there's an article about the popularity of Hulk Hogan among the Orang Tulu in Malaysia. They're a rainforest group, and they would love watching old VHS tapes of Hulk Hogan in the 90s while they were taking long riverboat voyages up and down the river. And Nick, if you want that citation, it's in I believe it's in a book called Global Goes Local. And a bunch of essays from various folks about global popular culture. And that particular article is about Hulk Hogan. And it talks about how he kind of represented for them the sort of simplicity and honesty of good old fashioned sort of masculine virtue. Obviously not, a nationalist sort of American thing for them, but something even more basic. So he definitely had the it factor.
Thank you. I didn't know about that. And that's called Global Goes Local or Local Goes Global.
I think it's called Global Goes Local. And I think Timothy Craig was the editor, but I'm not positive on that. But it's about Hulk Hogan and the rainforest.
Okay, I think I just found it. Thank you. And I will upload my bibliography as requested. I didn't ignore that. So, yes.
Terrific.
Great. I think that is kind of it for this panel. Feel free to stick around, talk some more. We are going to be, short little 10-minute break, and then at 4:15, Shane is going to be hosting a happy hour of Jeopardy. So I hope everyone stays on to play some Jeopardy with us. And I'm sure he will come on and explain kind of the rules and the structure of how it's going to go.
I will.
Okay.
Dina, I saw that you wrote about a TV show called Young Rock. I don't know what Young Rock is. What should I write in the Padlet about this?
My son started watching it. It came out this year. It looks like there's 5 episodes at least. I don't even know who's airing it. I'm gonna guess must be on Amazon Prime, maybe is what we were watching. It's about Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's growing up. It's on Hulu. Okay, yeah, it's it's actually really good. It's pretending that he's running for president in 2032 or something, and they do flashbacks of his life. And I knew nothing about him, and I assumed that it's a true story that his father was a pro wrestler. And
Yeah.
Okay, and
The original Rock, Rocky Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the set design and the costuming are just spot on for the 1970s. The actors are all really good, and I'm learning a lot about pro wrestling I didn't know anything about before. So I highly recommend it if you are interested in pro wrestling at all. It kind of reminds me of Everybody Hates Chris, but it's about a family that are involved in pro wrestling.
I put it on our Padlet. I watched there's a movie called Fighting with My Family that I think that came out in the spring or the summer.
Great film.
Also, like, The Rock is
Highly
in it.
recommended. If you haven't seen it and you like wrestling, I don't understand. Brett, have
Even
you
if you
seen that?
don't like wrestling, it's an interesting piece of a woman's voice, right, inside of a subculture.
Well, everyone should see that. Brett, have you seen this?
I actually have not had a chance to watch Wrestling with My Family yet.
It's
in part, I'm just was not a big fan of Paige as a wrestler, so I didn't see the need to invest in watching a biopic of her in a movie.
But
I mean, I do keep
the actor
hearing
who
really
plays
good
her
things.
is amazing.
Yeah,
I mean,
plays her.
and I know The Rock has a cameo, and Nick Frost plays her dad, and I always like Nick Frost in anything. So
the cast is great.
Yeah, I might have to check that out at some point.
And Cersei is her mom. But what's the actress's name? Amanda Pugh, I think. Maybe the first name's wrong.
It's Florence Pugh.
Thank you, Florence Pugh. Shane, have you seen it?
I have not. No, I have not seen it yet. That was something that was on my list. And I think I saw that it did actually get really good reviews as well. I think it was sitting on like a 70 or an 80 something on Rotten Tomatoes.
Better.
Not that makes too huge a difference, but
it's even better than her performance in Little Women. It's amazing.
So that was actually one of my favorite movies from that year. So I definitely do need to watch that.
It tops it. You got to see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ooh, I'm gonna watch it tonight.
It's very good. Can confirm.
Yeah, I don't make recommendations lately because, they carry too much weight being a professor in a popular culture department. I shouldn't.
Well, while we have a bunch of people